inviting me. And I'm just thrilled to be able to share what it is that I know with you guys about circus history in our region. There's just an extraordinary treasure trove of primary source material out there. And I have found some really new and interesting material, I think, to add to the narratives that everybody has been discussing in these circles. So the title of my talk is Zebras in Brewster's Barns. And originally it was Putnam and Westchester counties, but Dutchess kept popping up, so I figured we'd throw it in there as well, and circus history. So the illustrations here that I have on the left are an advertisement for the Howe's Circus from 1858, and a classified ad, sorry, for the sale of the Van Amberg menagerie on the right there. Oh, let's see. Come on, people. There we go. So one of the things that I think we need to take a look at when we're talking about circus history, and again, there's quite a lot of play. If you've looked at these advertisements and seen posters, you'll see a lot of references to England. Not surprisingly, because all of this starts, some of it even, just right immediately after the American Revolutionary War. But it really does have its roots in the 18th century. Certainly in the philosophies, the way that thought changes, and in fact, the whole idea of collecting animals or exotic things really goes back to the age of exploration, when a lot of rulers across the world began collecting exotic animals and things and had menageries. By the middle of the 18th century, Linnaeus and others begin to classify those animals. They begin to describe them and put them into groups. And then another really important thing to think about is how much less visual the world was in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, because they're just, the printing press really drives on the French Revolution. And in fact, but prior to that, books were really exclusive to relatively wealthy people. We also get a lot of printing technologies throughout the course of the 19th century that will really drive all of this promotional material that's attached to the circus. A British wood engraver called Thomas Bewick publishes a general history of quadrupeds in the 1870s in England. He's from Newcastle. And then an American guy from New York called Dr. Alexander Anderson publishes a reprint of that book right about 1804. And these are really some of the first more popularly available books that had illustrations of animals in them. And again, menageries, the Tower of London had a collection of menagerie animals, exotic animals. So there's a lot of that stuff going on just generally. Okay, let me see. There we go. Okay, so when we talk about visualizing animals in the early 1800s, again, woodcuts are still relatively expensive to do, so that newspaper advertisements tend not to be very well illustrated. And that remains true well into the 19th century, into the middle of the 19th century, so that the result of that is that people really are reliant on typefaces, interesting typefaces to kind of jazz things up and make them cool. The image on the left is a circus poster that was printed in Lambeth in South London in 1844. And again, I think is a really good example of the multitude of typefaces used to create some excitement, some visual excitement. And then the image to the right, and I apologize, I didn't think of how the people on the right here would block out these slides, but we're all learning these technologies, is just an advertisement from the Newcastle newspaper when Bewick's book comes out there. This is an advertisement from the New York Evening Post from 1818. Again, a female seal had been discovered at Amboy in New Jersey and brought to a menagerie on Warren Street. But I think if we look at this from the description given, it should suppose the sight of it would be quite an object for the curious. So again, I think that really gives us a sense of how much excitement these things engendered, these animals, these exotic animals. And here's, this one I think is particularly interesting. Another ad from the New York Evening Post from January of 1840. Now the Zoological Institute that gets started in Somers in 1835 moves over to New York City. And the standard narrative is that it goes bankrupt during the financial panics in 1837. But the interesting thing, and again, the reason I think it's so cool to take a look at these topics again, especially as more and more information is available to us digitally, is that I found this ad for the same thing in the same location at 37 Bowery in an 1840 paper. So clearly this is I don't know, the second gen of that particular zoological institute. Not sure what's going on there, but really interesting stuff to have a look at. There are so many circus families. I just kind of cherry picked a bunch of them. And if people are sort of looking for things to do as we shelter in place, if you have a look at the local newspapers that are online, the Brewster Standard is online at the Brewster Library's website. You can search for obituaries, showman, circus. I mean, when I just did a broad search for the circus, it brought up like over 2,000 hits. So you can keep busy for a very long time reading this material. Louis Lent, and again, so many of these people, I think the takeaway here is so many of these people intermarry. Again, they sort of, they splay out between Connecticut and Westchester and Putnam. Louis Lent, again, is related to Benjamin Lent, partner to Hacaliah Bailey from Somers. The Maybes, Ed and Jerry Maybe. Seth Howes manages their circus before he starts his own, and they are the ones that move to Wisconsin and start the circus there. Seth B. Howes and his brother Nathan, obviously very important to Brewster's circus history. And we'll see just to the economy of Brewster itself, frankly, as we go along. James E. Kelly was a banker in Brewster. He owned a farm where a lot of circus animals wintered on Star Ridge Road. He was married to a daughter of Daniel Drew. The Townsends, lots of Townsends. James Raymond from Carmel had a traveling menagerie by the 1820s. Isaac Van Amberg was a lion tamer born in Fishkill, but wintered his animals in Amenia, so southern, sort of southeastern Dutchess County, still very rural, a very rural part of the world. Hyatt Frost was born in Southeast, was a partner to Van Amberg, and Bill Lewis drove teams of horses, 6 to 8 horses. I'm assuming for Howe's circus, but it was unclear in the Brewster Standard there. This is a clipping, and again, I think that this presentation makes a strong case for the digitization of our collections generally. This is actually a little detail from the Reed map of Putnam County from 1876, and you can find that in the New York Heritage website, which sort of merged all of the regional New York library collections. It was originally called HRVH. You can actually find it hrvh.org. It will still take you to the link. But you can find a great collection of Putnam County maps. And in fact, we can see all kinds of the Kelly House. Star Ridge Road is sort of to the just left of center, running north and south. Just left of the trees toward the bottom there. And there's literally, you can't swing the proverbial 19th century cat without hitting a Bailey or a Barnum or a Howes or one of these families that were available or that were active in circus life. And that becomes, it has some interesting manifestations in Brewster's history. There's actually a pretty regular feature in the Brewster Standard called Show Notes that gives all kinds of contemporary information about what's going on with the various traveling circuses, that because it was just local business, it was what people were involved in, and again, I think that's it gives us just a treasure trove of sort of, you know, incremental information about what happens on these tours and the kinds of shifts and changes that happen. So you can go have a look at that map if you want to. I'm truly indebted to Grace Zimmerman. She bought the painting on the left, which was a sketch done by the Putnam County artist Eleanor Beach, mother to Eleanor Fitchin, who was very important in the Southeast Museum, and it's kind of the setting up of that and landmarks, etc. She does this sketch of one of the barns, the Kelly barns, although she does this well after it has gone, when they owned the property in 1847. And the photograph on the bottom was taken by one of the riders. Again, they were all neighbors on Star Ridge Road. Photograph being from right around the turn of the century, 1900, 1905. And the top right photograph is a photo of what that property looks like today. Again, I'm truly indebted to Grace for showing me this amazing clock in the Somers Historical Society's collection. I'm a material culture person, so I deal with the history of stuff, everyday stuff. And this clock is one of my top 5 favorite objects of my entire career. And Dick Flint, who wrote a great essay in the Encyclopedia of New York City, he has contributed some information about these clocks. One of them, there were apparently 2 of them. There may be some Howe's provenance to them. Not quite sure, but it seems as if this clock is made from wood engravings of animals, planks of wood engraved animals that may or may not have been used for circus posters. Anyway, I just think it's a delicious object. And you can go see that when the Somers Historical Society opens back up. The other interesting thing to me is that a lot of old timers talk about the Monkeytown School. So the neighborhood where all the animal barns in Brewster was called Monkeytown because of that. If you Google Monkeytown, you'll find all kinds of hits where the old timers are talking about, they refer to the Monkeytown School, the one-room schoolhouse that they all went to. So I think that the circus has this very deep imprimatur about about this particular section of Brewster that's kind of roughly from Peaceable Hill around the corner of the Borden Bridge to where the old Borden Milk Factory was. And then as you go along 6 and 202 in a contemporary sense, as you're going toward the interstate and 22, then you can swing up to the right and Star Ridge Road is up there. But I think it's just interesting to, what things are called and that, that moniker really sticks. One of the primary sources that I think are extraordinarily underused in local history, but I find really interesting, are the federal census records for both industry and agriculture. And this one is from 1850. And if you see the second name there is Nathan Howes, Seth Howes' older brother. And the amazing thing about these records is that they give you very specific information about how big farms were, exactly what was being produced in quantity, and what animals were on the farm. So I had one of those Brick Hits Head realizations from the cartoons a couple days ago. I thought, I wonder if the zoo animal or the circus animals are listed there. But in fact, they are not, sadly, for reasons I'm not really sure of. But these non-census or non-population census schedules were done between 1850 and 1880. And I'm not exactly sure why they stopped that, but they just have an amazing amount of information. You can search by county and then by town in region. Just extraordinary material there. We're just going to quickly look at Seth B. Howe's house, his first kind of fancy mansion, Stonehenge. This is a photo of what it looks like in a contemporary sense. And then he builds an even bigger house called Morningthorpe, which is on Turk Hill Road in Brewster in 1893. Rossiter and Wright, the New York City architects, help him with that. It's built over a number of years. And there's also a number of really interesting articles, like the one below it here, where they talk about the heating and plumbing job involves an expenditure of nearly $5,000. And that was in 1893. So that was a lot of money. So I think that if we think about what, what it means to have a celebrity, a late 19th century celebrity, it would be kind of like if Ziegfeld or Roy moved in next door and, built a big fancy house for themselves. Lily Deacon Forepaugh emigrates to the United States from England. She was a circus equestrian for Howe's Great London Circus, and she comes to marry Adam Forepaugh Jr. In 1882. They get divorced eventually. He was the son of the Philadelphia circus owner, himself a ringmaster and animal trainer, fairly formidable animal trainer. But Lily Forepaugh was really a beloved figure in Brewster, and she, at the turn of the 20th century, installs a water trough for animals on Main Street in Brewster that was then taken off and melted down during the World War I war effort. But she herself became an animal rights activist, was very involved in horse shows throughout the course of the rest of her life in Brewster, and was a philanthropist until she dies in Brewster in 1846. So photo on the left is of her, on the right is of Adam Forepaugh Jr., and then a nice trade card of that circus. Seth B. Howes, when he dies, he creates for himself a really incredible mausoleum in the Milltown Cemetery, which is on Milltown Road, just outside of Brewster. And you can see at the bottom of that photo, there's actually a ring around a circus ring around his mausoleum that's kind of being taken away by the photos of us on the right there. But he clearly is one of the most important citizens in the town of Brewster, the village of Brewster, and himself is a major philanthropist to things like St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and in fact to the upkeep of the Milltown Cemetery itself. He's on a lot of those local committees. And when I was county historian, there's actually a check of his that he had written to Fanny Crosby, the Methodist hymn writer, who was also another local. So lots of great primary sources here. There's also an amazing collection of letters between Seth and Nathan Howes when Seth is on the road touring in London in the 1850s. So again, lots of great local material here. I am truly indebted to the philatelic community and some of my husband's pals. He's involved in the State Revenue Society, which is a bunch of guys, mostly men, who collect revenue stamps. Revenue stamps were used to generate revenue, obviously, especially during wartime. And they were generally issued for kind of luxury things. So this is and a big shout out to Herman Ivester for this particular scan of the license from the state of Arkansas in a town called Des Arc, Arkansas, in Prairie County. The advance men of what was likely the Cooper Bailey circus got there in November about November 20th of 1879. And they got this, but I don't think they ever actually paid the $100 because all of these local municipalities, again, would be charging these, you know, outsiders this tax. So after Herman sent this scan to me through my husband and a bunch of these other guys who are interested in circus stuff and maybe on this call, I did a bit of newspaper research, and in the Little Rock, Arkansas newspaper, there was this ad on the top left, and a bunch of the guys from the Cooper Bailey tour book are listed in this ad. So I'm fairly confident that it was in fact the Cooper Bailey and Company Circus, but they took a different tack. They didn't go to Des Arc. They wound up going from Little Rock a different way. So again, it's a whole different way of looking at circuses from that business perspective that I think we don't normally get to, or the rest of us in the normal kind of circus history narrative don't get to see much of. But I've got some great examples here. This is, again, another one of these special tax stamps with coupons that would have been torn out, and special thanks go to Mike Farrell and to Casey Joe White in his office. My husband actually had done some research and had written a number of years ago that 4,050 of these were produced, and this is the only one that's known to exist. So I think that's makes it really special, but keep your eyes peeled because there may be more of them out there. It's just, they may be in folders or people's attics or closets and nobody knows what they are. And this is another one, big thanks to Alan Hicks for this one. Both the scan of this great poster that he has in his collection of the merry-go-round, and I began to look at that and I thought, that's really just a circus parade that's captured. And I don't think I can think of them in any other way now. But this is a special tax stamp or a special tax receipt for $6.60 for the merry-go-round, or flying ponies they're called, which I think is kind of great, from 1889. And then I think it's really interesting to kind of finish off my part of the talk with this chromolithograph poster that was printed by the Strobridge Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, right around 1895, to just look at, you know, from in this century, throughout the course of the 19th century, how much better these printing technologies get at illustrating the circuses. And it also gives us Barnum and Bailey, and I'm gonna just hand it over to Bruce at this point. And I thank you for your attention. Okay, let me see.
Hi there.
Great.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I just want to hold on 1 second, if you don't mind,
Nope.
because we had 2 or 3 people that were trying to log on, and I want to see if they've gotten here yet. And one of them was, and if I could ask everyone to mute their own conversations, that would be great. Okay, I think I see them. So, since we're taping this today, Bruce is a distant cousin of Phineas. Grandfather Edwin Noble worked as a wheelwright in the Barnum and Bailey Circus winter quarters in Bridgeport from 1896 until the early 1900s. In keeping with his circus heritage, Bruce was president of the Friends of the Barnum Museum in the 1980s and co-chaired the Worldwide Circus Summit in 2015. He's been a member of the Circus Fans Association of America and the Circus Historical Society for many years. Bruce is currently in 2005 after 34 years of active duty and reserve service. Thank you for your service, Bruce. He recently retired from Stewart Title Guarantee Company, where he was an executive vice president, director of Stewart Title's National Commercial Services Division. And Bruce now lives in Stratford, Connecticut. So without further ado, Bruce, take it over, please.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I'll start at the top. Well, thank you. And Sarah, I really enjoyed your presentation. As you were going through it, I realized there's a lot of places where we're going to overlap and link into Barnum. So a terrific segue into this part of the program. Here we're going to talk about the home of the greatest show on earth, Bridgeport, Connecticut. For those of you who are not from this area, Bridgeport is along Long Island Sound, not too far from New York City, in Somers, New York, actually. And for the circus fans that are out there, it's about 1,000 miles from Baraboo, Wisconsin, which was the home of the Ringling Brothers Circus, and about 1,200 miles from Sarasota, Florida, where the winter quarters went after it closed in Bridgeport in the late 1920s. Bridgeport is an old city, goes back to the 1600s. It's the most populous city in Connecticut, about 145,000 as of 2010, it's probably a little more now. And of course, it was the home of the greatest show on earth from November 12th, 1881 up until April 27th, 1927, almost 50 years. So here's our guy, Phineas Taylor Barnum, and as Grace indicated, he's a distant cousin of mine. PT, as we like to call him, was born in Bethel, Connecticut, and he died in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And those of us who have seen the movie The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman was a nice, little fictitious, but generally accurate story of Barnum. And so you know a little bit about who he is and what he did. He was sort of a Renaissance man. He did a little bit about everything. He started out as a storekeeper. He was a publisher. He was a concert exhibitor and promoter, manufacturer, developer, museum owner, operator, politician, circus owner, and operator. So he did a lot of things. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Barnum really didn't get involved in the circus until he was in his 60s. It was a retirement job for him, essentially. So here's his show business career before 1881. And as most people know, he started out with exhibiting Joyce Heth, who he claimed to be George Washington's nurse, which would have put her at a great age, and which of course was a humbug, but you know, that's what he did. That's how he started out. And then he started into this grand scientific and musical theater, and as Grace indicated, it was a period of discovery, and people were interested in learning about all kinds of scientific things, and that was sort of his initial foray into show business. He had a variety show at Vauxhall Garden, and then he opened up his American Museum in New York City. In 1842, he hired Tom Thumb, and he put together the Fiji Mermaid. The Fiji Mermaid was actually another one of his hoaxes, but essentially it was a monkey sewed together with fish, and there's actually one in the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport if you'd like to go see one. But it was part of his scientific exhibit that he had in the museum. He opened up a museum in Baltimore, and then in '49 he opened one in Philadelphia. So he had multiple museums. And those of you who saw the movie, the big part of his career was promoting Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale. And he started to get into concert promoting, and she was the hit of the day. And he brought her over from Europe, and she performed in the United States. In 1851, he started his Great Asiatic Caravan Museum and Menagerie. So as you can see, the names were quite explosive and descriptive, I should say, of what he was trying to accomplish. In 1855, he sold his American Museum collection, and he and Tom Thumb, who he discovered in Bridgeport, and by the way, he and Tom Thumb were close friends until their deaths, and Tom Thumb ended up being a very wealthy man at the end of his career. And so P.T. Barnum and Tom toured Europe. Then he came back in 1860, and he bought the American Museum collection again. And then this is during the Civil War. 1862 is when he got involved with Commodore Nutt, who was another small person, little person that he discovered. And then Tom Thumb married Lavinia Warren, who was also another small person, and they had quite a wedding in New York City. And then in 1865, his museum burned down for the first time. And as we go through the chronology here, he had quite a few fires. And from what I understand, that was the period when a lot of things burned down because of just the way things were built, and between the gas lights and wood fires and whatnot, it was pretty common. But anyways, his museum burns down for the first time in 1865. So then he tours with a museum that he calls the Barnum and Van Amberg Museum and Menagerie. And then his American Museum in New York City burns down again in 1868. And then he tours the world with Mr. and Mrs. Tom Thumb and Commodore Nutt and Minnie Warren. So he had the two couples with him and toured pretty much Europe during that period. Here's the beginning of the circus. 1871, P.T. Barnum's Museum, Menagerie, and Circus. And most people credit 1871 as the period of the use of the word, the title, the greatest show on earth, which, by the way, is going to be celebrating its 150th anniversary next year. And in 1862, he moves by rail for the first time. He moves the circus by rail. And as many of you probably know, at that point, up to that point, circuses traveled overland through muddy roads. And once they got the ability to travel on a train, they were able to extend their tour quite a bit and improve the efficiency. In 1874, he opened up his Roman Hippodrome in New York. And 1876, he had his centennial circus. And of course, that's the centennial of the United States, 1776 to 1876, which toured. In 1880, he enters into his partnership with James A. Bailey and James Hutchinson to form the Barnum and London Great Moral Shows. And all of these facts come from Arthur Saxon's Selected Letters book here. So right around this time is when the winter quarters comes into being. He built his winter quarters during 1880 and 1881 on 10 acres of land along the main line of New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad at a cost of about $200,000. And I'm an attorney, a real estate lawyer by profession, retired now, but naturally I had to do the title search. And in discovering the title search of his property, he owned the property in his own name, not in the name of his company or corporation or anything, in his own name, until he died in 1891. He moved his Barnum and London Great Moral Shows into the winter quarters at the end of its tour in November of 1881. So this is the beginning of the circus actually wintering in Bridgeport. Again, being a real estate lawyer, kind of a geek here, this is what the legal description is of the property. It's about 10 acres, and it's bordered by these streets and along Railroad Avenue, which is where the main line of the, which is now Metro North Railroad. There's an image of what it looked like in 1881. As you can see, along the bottom here is the main line of the railroad, which is still there. And this is Railroad Avenue. And then these are the buildings of his winter quarters. In 1882, the elephant baby Bridgeport was born in the winter quarters to Queen and Chieftain. And this is the beginning of, as we heard from the previous, from Sarah's talk, the existence of elephants in the United States. And there's one that was born in captivity in Bridgeport. Jumbo arrived in 1882, and we all know who Jumbo is, the huge African elephant that came from London that Barnum purchased. And Jumbo was with the show for just a relatively short period. Tom Thumb he passed away in 1883, so this is sort of the end of Barnum's period as an exhibitor with Tom Thumb and Lavinia Warren and Jenny Lind and more into the circus. And he is buried right across the road from P.T. Barnum in Mountain Grove Cemetery in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Barnum's white elephant arrived in New York City in 1884. Jumbo was killed by a train up in St. Thomas, Ontario in 1885. The story goes that he was being loaded into the train to move, and there was a train coming on a track that wasn't supposed to be there, and couldn't stop in time, and Jumbo was hit by a train. In 1885, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, Bailey, James A. Bailey, who was his partner, retired from the show, and Barnum and Hutchinson formed a new show with James Cooper and W.W. Cole. In 1886, the little elephant, Baby Bridgeport, dies, and her body is still in the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport. Of course, it's taxidermy, but Kathy confirmed yesterday that Baby Bridgeport is still there. Hutchison, Cooper, and Cole withdraw from the partnership, and James A. Bailey becomes Barnum's equal partner to form the Barnum and Bailey Circus in 1887. And then the next year, Jenny Lind dies. Same year, fire destroys the winter quarters, and the winter quarters burned down a number of times as well. But this was the first time that it burned. At that time, Barnum was thinking about moving the winter quarters out of Bridgeport, and I came across this letter, and it was a petition from the citizens of Bridgeport asking Barnum to please don't leave Bridgeport. People signed it and said, we want the winter quarters in Bridgeport, please stay. This is an assessor's map, a tax assessor's map that shows what it looked like in 1888. And, as you can see here, this is, whoops, back up. This is the Railroad Avenue area, and Norman Street, and the tracks come in on this angle here, and these are all railroad tracks in the various barns and buildings that were on the property. That's in 1888. In 1889, Barnum and Bailey Circus departs for London to perform at London's Olympia during the winter of 1889 and 1890. And he had been to London several times before with Tom Thumb and Lavinia Warren and Jenny Lind. So this is the first time he actually brings the circus back to England. The show returns in 1890 to open in New York City. And with Bailey and Cooper, Barnum acquires Adam Forepaw's Circus. And back to what Sarah was talking about, this was Forepaw, the same Forepaw that that Sarah referred to. In 1890, Barnum is stricken with his final illness, and from what I saw, it was congestion of the brain and a weak heart, which I guess was a stroke. And he died in 1891 and is buried in Mountain Grove Cemetery across the road from Tom Thumb. And the value of his estate was $4.3 million in 1891, which is quite a bit, of course. Here's his grave, picture of his grave site in Mountain Grove. It's a beautiful cemetery, and it's really quite neat to see his grave there and his family, and again Tom Thumb literally across the road. In 1893, of course, Bailey carried on with the show. 2 large buildings were erected to house all the cat animals and smaller hay species, in addition to other buildings. And in 1896, this is when my great-grandfather, Edwin J. Noble, was hired by Bailey to work as a wheelwright to help lower all of the circus wagons in preparation for their upcoming 5-year European tour. And from family lore and legend, I found quite a bit of information about my great-grandfather's role. I found actually a newspaper article in which he's reminiscing about how they created this arch that they put the wagons under to make sure that they got the right height. I ended up inheriting my great-grandfather's wheelwright tools, which I still have. And as you can see there, and that's a very big toolbox. This is a huge wrench that was used to take the nut off the wheel, and there's a long screwdriver, and there's some spoke shaves. Here they are again, the wrench for the wheel, and the screwdriver and a spoke shave. They're really quite big, very heavy. And there's the tool chest that I still have, and that was in the winter quarters in Bridgeport for a number of years. This is what the winter quarters looked like after they did some more construction. This is 1896. And again, this is the railroad, Metro North here. And the train, actually, this ramp came down on this side, and they'd have to go under. And if you can still go there today, this underpass is on an angle like that. So that's the way it came into the winter quarters. And all the various buildings were here. And then this is property of Sealy, which Barnum ended up taking over as well. Not Barnum, but Bailey did for the winter quarters later on. So from 1897 to 1902, Barnum and Bailey Circus tours Europe. And during that period, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show used the Barnum and Bailey winter quarters during the period that Barnum and Bailey Circus was in Europe. And of course, their big competitor in the United States were the Ringling Brothers out of Baraboo, Wisconsin. And when Barnum and Bailey was away for 5 years, Ringling Brothers pretty much took over the market, and they became as large as Barnum and Bailey. And so it was a problem when Barnum and Bailey came back. They had a formidable competitor in Ringling Brothers. Bailey dies in 1906, and after he dies, the Ringling Brothers purchase the Barnum and Bailey Circus for $400,000. And at that point, it comes out of Bailey's estate. This is what the winter quarters looked like in 1917. You could see there's more tracks in there. This is Railroad Avenue again. It's a little different angle, but it was a little more complex. So 1907 to 1918, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circuses toured separately. So the Ringling Brothers, who owned both shows, just divided up the country, and they toured separately, two very big shows. And this is interesting. In October of 1918, Ringling Brothers Circus travels to Bridgeport instead of Baraboo at the end of their 1918 tour. And that was partially as a result of the 1918 influenza pandemic, interestingly. Ringling Brothers Circus was actually in Georgia at that time, and Waycross, Georgia is when they finished their tour, and a lot of the dates were being canceled because of the influenza pandemic back then. Very much like now, the officials didn't want circuses to come into town. They didn't want large gatherings of people. And the Barnum and Bailey Circus was actually in Houston at that same time. And the Ringling Brothers decided, you know what, we're not going back to Baraboo. We're going to bring Ringling Brothers to Bridgeport. Barnum and Bailey came back to Bridgeport. And in the next year, they combined, and this is when it became Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined shows, which opened in Madison Square Garden. Here's a photograph from the 1920s, and you can see, of course, all the railroad cars there and some of the buildings. And by then, of course, it's Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. There's another shot of that. And you can see this was in the wintertime. There's all this little snow here and there. And it was really congested, very congested winter quarters. These were two really big circuses that were squashed into basically 10 acres. And these are the buildings that they had for various housing of animals, painting, building wagons, repairing trains, building tents, etc. There's another shot of it. You can see how tightly everything was here. All together, there were many, many wagons, and it was a crowded winter quarters. And here's another fire. This is 1924, where there was a fire in this building. And you can see the destruction from the next day. And I think it was this building right here that actually burned down. And more wagons. And here, you know, there's a team, and this, what they would do in the spring is they'd have to get the horses exercised and used to pulling the wagons again. So they would hook them up and drag them around the winter quarters of the streets to get them exercised and in good shape before they started their show. But this was a typical, you know, hitch, 6-horse hitch here to pull one of the big circus wagons. And here are the wagons loaded on the flat cars, ready to go out for the season. And you can see there's 2 levels here. This is on the street level in the winter quarters. And then up here, this is the Metro North New Haven Railroad line. And to this day, it's elevated. You can still see the electrical the wires above the tracks there. This is what it looks like today. And you can still see the same structure for the wires, which are overhead wires. In New York, there's a 3rd rail, but in Connecticut, it's overhead, and they have a pantograph. But this property is where the winter quarters was. And, you know, that last photograph was probably taken in this area here. And you can see this is elevated. Now, this is interesting. This is a picture of the horses, you know, in part of the winter quarters. And I'd like to point out that over here, there are 3 houses with gambrel style roof lines over on the right here. And this is what it looks like today. Those buildings are still there. These guys right here, and there they are. And some more pictures of the wagons, and a lot of these are historic wagons, all the wood carvings. This is also, these buildings back here are houses on the north side of the winter quarters property. And there they are. They're still there today. They're 3-family houses. This is the view from that railroad underpass I was telling you about. It came on an angle, so this was the entrance to the winter quarters right here. The tracks kind of came in right where this backstop is into the, and this is the property. It's a park today, obviously. And all the big buildings were along here. This is Warden Avenue here. And there's a view again, looking towards the railroad line. You can see the Metro North tracks there. And there's that underpass I was telling you about. The ramp to get off the line was on the other side, and they came down and came underneath this right into the winter quarters. 1924, the fire destroyed the paint shop and a train shed. Charles Edward Ringling dies in Sarasota, leaving John Ringling as the last surviving brother in 1926. And in 1927, the Bridgeport winter quarters closes, and most of the show's equipment is moved to Sarasota, Florida. The tent making operation remains in Bridgeport for a few months. As I mentioned earlier, title to the property passed to P.T. Barnum's heirs by a certificate of distribution in 1928. So they kept his estate open. He died in 1891. They kept his estate open all those years, and I'm assuming that was the property was leased, you know, from the Ringling Brothers or the Circus to Barnum's estate. And the lease expired in May 1st, 28. In 1934, the property was purchased by the city of Bridgeport to be used for athletic fields. And this is what it looks like today. And a couple more pictures, what it looked like in the 1920s. And I'd like to thank these folks, Mary Witkowski. I did this presentation several years ago, and Mary, who's since retired, worked at the Bridgeport Library. It helped me, and Melissa Houston at the Barnum Museum. And there's my little talk on the winter quarters. Any questions?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
all right. That's okay. Let me see if I can find me.